It's great pleasure and honor for me this morning to speak in this prestigious summit and also in front of this prestigious and distinguished audiences. In my presentation, actually the title seems to be a new model, but I want to say that it's not entirely new, but the Korean regulatory reform system, which I explained today, is the product of 30 years of try and error in South Korea in regulatory reform. So the regulatory reform system we have in South Korea is a kind of a product of an evolution of regulatory system. And that's what I want to share with you this morning. So this regulatory reform has been one of the top priorities of all the consecutive governments since the 1990s for more than 30 years. However, regulatory reform up to 1997 had some limitations. The reform methods up to 1997 can be described as a bottom-up approach. That means, under such authoritarian culture in the society and the government in Korea, the private sector must beg and demand to change regulatory system and deregulate and upgrade regulatory system. And it was the government officials, the regulators, who decided whether to accept it or not. So it's basically authoritarian in kind of a business sector demands, and it's a kind of a favor given by regulators whether to relax regulation or change the regulation. In 1998, as you may remember, South Korean economy was hit by a foreign exchange crisis, and IMF came to Korea to bail out the economy, but with a few severe austerity measures. One of them was regulatory reform. And at the time, the newly elected President Kim Dae-jung initiated an entirely different and radical approach of reform. The major difference of the reform in 1998 was the method of reducing the total number of regulations. Now the burden of proof, whether to abolish the regulation or keep it, was put on the regulators. That is, regulators must justify the need and appropriateness of their methods in front of an independent panel. To perform this function, the Regulatory Reform Committee, which I represent today, was established. If regulators fail to convince the committee, those regulations shall be abolished or changed. Based on this principle, the President set a quantitative target of abolishing at least 50% of existing regulations by the end of 1998. As a result, the total number of regulations in Korea became substantially reduced. Actually, more than 5,000 regulations, or 49% of the existing regulations, were simply eliminated from the book, chopped off the book. This radical approach of getting rid of regulations has been known as Korean regulatory guillotine in international literatures. The Regulatory Reform Committee is now in its 25th year in existence, and the committee is accountable to the President and co-chaired by the Prime Minister and civilian chairman. And majority of the committee members should be a civilian representative by law. This means that committee decisions are made from the private sector's point of view, not the point of regulators. In other words, regulatory reform has become a permanent function of the government and the office of the Korea bureaucrat, whose sole mission is to regulate the regulators, have been created. Now the introduction and executive implementation of regulations is no longer the exclusive rights of regulating ministries and agencies. So what does Regulatory Reform Committee want to achieve through regulatory reform over the last 30 years? In other words, what was the vision of regulatory reform in Korea? First, needless to say, regulatory reform is aimed at improving national productivity and competitiveness. Second, regulatory reform is aimed at relieving businesses from excessive regulatory burden and reducing the overall social cost. Regulation is a hidden tax. Therefore, regulatory reform will have the same effect as tax cut without sacrificing government revenues. Third, regulatory reform is aimed at reducing corruption and abuse of power by making rules and procedures more transparent and easier to comply. This is a kind of a surprising aspect of regulatory reform. Fourth, regulatory reform is also aimed at improving quality of life by making regulatory enforcement more effective, especially in the area of social regulations, such as consumer protection, environmental protection, and worker protections. In these social regulation areas, mostly the problem is not the lack of regulations, but the loose enforcement of regulations. Also, the regulatory reform is aimed at encouraging private sector initiatives and creativity and facilitating economic integration between economies and countries by making rules and procedures more compatible with each other. So what are the bad regulations? Low-quality regulations. I want to emphasize that the purpose of regulatory reform is get rid of regulations, but enhance and improve the quality of regulations. So that's what I'm talking about. What are the low-quality regulations? Well, first, I want to emphasize it's not a matter of quantity. We experienced in 1998 chopping off 50% of Korean regulations on the book, eliminate them. And actually, the media and the business people say that nothing much changed. So we learned that it's a matter of quality, not the quantity, and the way regulations are implemented. So that's the core of regulatory problem. So we were aiming at that the regulations with vague rules and unpredictable results are low-quality regulations. In practice, vague and opaque regulations can create a very uncertain situation where nothing is certain, but nothing is impossible either. So this creates an environment conducive to corruption and abuse of power. And third, regulation with low compliance is bad regulation. Regulations that cause excessive social costs are bad regulations, and regulations unfair to honest people are bad regulations. Especially these regrettable culture of regulatory system where prohibition in principle, permission in exception is actually the most difficult hurdle for new industries and new technologies to develop. So what can we learn from Korean experience? First, we learned that there is a need for an independent agency to control regulatory quality. We need an independent agency within the government who controls the regulators. And by independent, I mean independent from the influence from other regulating ministries and agencies. And second, we learned that it is very important to harmonize national policy goals with regulatory reform. It's not a matter of politics and ideology. I would say regulatory reform is a matter of engineering and system design. And especially when there are opposition and resistance from vested interests, this harmonization process and stakeholders taking part in the process is very important to make reform to be effective. Third, we learned that it is important to make rules and procedure more transparent and to make requirements and procedures more realistic and easier to comply. Finally, I would like to make a brief comment. Regulatory reform has been one of the top priorities in South Korea for more than 30 years. We have a long way to go, I know that, but the need for better and smart regulations has become even more greater and important as technologies and markets evolve rapidly. We should not allow the old regulations of analog era to rule the digital revolution. It would be a great honor for me if my presentation today can contribute to shaping our common vision of shaping future government and better future for humanity. Thank you for your interest and your attention. Thank you very much.